The sun hung low over Montgomery, Alabama, painting long shadows across the worn courthouse steps. The breeze carried the low hum of traffic, the distant bark of a dog, and the heavy silence of history. On a concrete bench just outside the courthouse, an elderly black man sat with his back straight, his shoulders square, and his hands gently clasped around a neatly folded American flag. His name was Walter Gaines, but no one bothered to ask. He wore a brown wool coat, even in the June heat, a worn military cap with a faded insignia, and polished shoes that looked out of place among the scuffed sneakers and sandals of those passing by. His face, lined and stoic, seemed carved from time itself, eyes that had seen war, injustice, and too many sunrises spent waiting for fairness to arrive. People passed him like he was invisible. A pair of teenagers laughed at something on their phones. A woman in a business suit stepped around him, annoyed. A bailiff exiting the courthouse glanced once and kept walking. No one asked why he was there, or what the flag meant. They only saw what they were conditioned to see, an old black man, sitting too still in the wrong part of town. Inside the courthouse, Deputy Collins, fresh from academy and hungry to impress, watched Walter through the window. The longer the man sat there, the more uncomfortable Collins became. "Who's he waiting for?" Collins muttered, mostly to himself. No answer. He stepped outside and approached, resting one hand on the butt of his holstered gun, a habit he didn't even realize had formed. "You all right there, sir?" Collins asked. Walter didn't move. His eyes remained ahead, calm but distant. "I'm fine right here. This is government property. You can't just sit out here all day." Walter looked up at him now, not with fear or anger, just the kind of gaze that makes you feel like you're being measured. "Didn't know sitting quietly was a crime, officer." "It's not," Collins replied, shifting his weight. "But we've had complaints." "No one said a word to me." Collins frowned. "I'm gonna need you to move along. I'm not blocking anything. I'm not bothering anyone. Just sitting." Collins tapped the radio on his chest. "Dispatch, I've got a non-compliant male outside the courthouse, requesting backup." The word non-compliant fell like a stone into a pond, waves rippling through unseen layers of authority and fear. A few pedestrians paused, sensing something was brewing. Walter looked down at the flag in his lap. His fingers tightened, slightly around it. Not a word more from him. Within minutes, the rumble of tires rolled in. A second cruiser. Then a third. Sergeant Brody stepped out, tall, white, and carrying the quiet arrogance of someone who thought they'd already seen everything worth seeing. He took one look at Walter and sighed. "This the guy?" Collins nodded. Brody walked up, arms crossed. "Sir, you've been asked to move. Refusing to do so can be considered obstruction." Walter met his eyes. "This bench isn't yours, and neither is my grief." Brody raised an eyebrow. "Say again?" Walter said nothing. His silence wasn't defiance. It was deeper. The kind that comes after decades of being misunderstood on purpose. Brody turned to Collins. "Let's do this by the book. Call the K9. Collins hesitated. "For a guy sitting down?" "Standard procedure when there's non-compliance and potential threat," Brody said, loud enough for bystanders to hear. "He could be armed." A gasp came from a woman nearby. Someone began filming. Walter didn't flinch. The sound of a barking dog grew louder before the police K9 unit pulled up, a lean German shepherd straining on a leash in the back. Brody smirked. "Let's see how long he keeps sitting once he sees teeth." Inside the SUV, the dog barked again, not vicious, but alert. A handler stepped out, gave a nod, and released the dog. People began backing away. Phones were up. The tension had turned to static in the air, something electric and terrifying. Walter gently placed the flag beside him on the bench, and then the dog was released. It charged. Murmurs turned into gasps. And still, Walter didn't move. What happened next, no one could have predicted. The tension thickened as more police units flanked the courthouse steps, their lights flashing even though no crime had been committed. Spectators gathered across the street, instinctively pulling out phones. A few whispered, others simply watched, drawn to the escalating storm building around a man who hadn't even raised his voice. Sergeant Brody stood front and center, arms crossed over his tactical vest, a permanent scowl shadowing his jawline. Years on the force had carved away his empathy, replacing it with routine, control, and suspicion, especially toward men who looked like Walter Gaines. The K9 handler, Officer Rames, opened the SUV's rear hatch. The German Shepherd, lean and muscular, jumped down with practiced agility. Its bark echoed like a warning shot. It wasn't a pet. It was a weapon trained for submission. Brody didn't flinch. He motioned forward. "Get him off that bench. Use force if necessary." Walter sat exactly as he had before. Still. Silent. The flag now resting gently beside him like a second heartbeat. His eyes didn't meet the officer's. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just existed. Quietly, peacefully, defiantly. Brody stepped closer. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Stand up." Walter's voice came low and steady. "I've stood for this country longer than you've worn that badge. I've earned the right to sit here." The words cut like stone into the tension. But Brody didn't budge. "Apprehend." Officer Rames tightened his grip on the leash. The command was clear. It was time to make an example. The dog's muscles coiled. Gasps rose from the bystanders. Someone shouted, "Wait, he's just sitting!" 2. Lady Rames gave the order, "Take him." In an instant, the German Shepherd launched forward, jaws open, legs sprinting. Phones captured every frame. Walter didn't move. The dog closed the distance. Then, it happened. Just as the Shepherd reached Walter, it slowed. Its ears twitched. Its gait softened. Its aggressive bark turned into a curious whine. Walter didn't flinch. He merely lifted his hand, palm open. The dog sniffed the air, took a few cautious steps, and sat, right in front of Walter, tail gently thudding against the pavement, head tilted upward. A stunned silence overtook the street. Walter reached forward, resting a hand on the dog's head. The Shepherd responded by pressing its nose into his palm, eyes soft, posture submissive. A moment passed, then another. Someone in the crowd whispered, "What just happened?" Officer Rames froze. Brody's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Walter finally looked up. His voice was soft but unshakable. "Even he knows who I am." The dog lay down completely, stretching beside Walter's feet like it had found its rightful place. Brody stormed forward. "Rames, what the hell are you doing? Call the dog off." Rames tried. "Heel." The dog didn't move. Brody barked. "That's a trained police dog. It's supposed to obey." Walter smiled faintly. "He is obeying, just not you." The dog, sensing the rising voices, whined again and nudged closer to Walter's leg for comfort. The crowd began murmuring, louder now, not with panic but awe. More phones rose. Someone live-streamed. Another voice shouted, "He's a vet, isn't he?" Brody spun around, pointing a finger. "Everyone back. This is an active scene." But the moment had already escaped his control. A young woman in a nurse's uniform stepped forward. "I've seen dogs do this before," she said. "They remember scents. That man, he's trained dogs before. The dog knows him." Walter looked up at the woman, then back at Brody. "You think uniforms mean loyalty, but real loyalty's deeper than cloth. This dog, he remembers something you never learned." Brody stepped forward again, hand on his taser now. "I won't warn you again. Stand up and surrender." Walter didn't move. Officer Rames, unsure now, tried again. "Kilo, heel." The dog glanced toward Rames, then turned his head back to Walter, refusing to leave his side. Walter gave the dog one soft command. "Stay," and stay it did. This wasn't a refusal. It was reverence. Brody's face reddened with anger, humiliation swelling in his throat. He turned to Collins. "Cuff him." Collins hesitated. "Sarge, maybe we should ask who he—" "Cuff him, now." Walter looked at the flag on the bench beside him, then at the dog whose loyalty didn't need orders. He took a slow breath and whispered, not to the officers, but to himself, "They still don't see." The crowd watched as the youngest officer approached with shaking hands and steel cuffs, unaware the world had just witnessed a man break no law, raise no hand, and still be treated like a threat. And yet, the dog, trained to attack, had offered more humanity than any man in uniform that day. Time seemed suspended. The German Shepherd, Kylo, remained flat on the ground, chin resting between his paws, eyes never leaving Walter's face. Officer Rames tried again, voice louder now, more desperate than commanding. "Kilo, Heel! Nothing. The crowd remained hushed, uncertain whether they were witnessing a miracle or a rebellion. Walter rested a wrinkled hand on the dog's head. The simple gesture carried the weight of decades. Then, his voice, no longer quiet, but filled with the gravity of memory. "You're not disobeying," Walter murmured to the dog. "You're remembering." And as his fingers gently stroked Kilo's ears, the flashback bloomed, not in the minds of the officers, but in the soul of Walter Gaines. Vietnam, 1968. The roar of helicopters, sweat-drenched uniforms, gunfire in the distance. Young Private First Class Walter Gaines, barely 22, crouched in the jungle mud, one arm around a German shepherd named Duke. "Hold," he whispered, voice steady despite the chaos. Duke didn't bark, didn't flinch. His training was precise. But more than that, he trusted the man beside him. Together they'd walked minefields, sniffed out ambushes, pulled wounded men from death's edge. His dog once leaped onto a grenade before it could kill his men. Walter had carried that weight for decades. They were soldiers, not pets, not property. Soldiers, back to the present. Walter's voice shook with age, but not with weakness. "I trained combat dogs before most of you were born. I wore a uniform while this country burned my neighborhood. I fought overseas while being called names back home." Kilo nuzzled deeper against him, tail gently wagging. Officer Rames looked rattled. His grip on the leash slackened. Deputy Collins glanced nervously toward Brody, his hands hovering near the cuffs but unsure. "He recognizes me," Walter said softly. "The scent, the tone, the peace. That dog knows what I've done, even if none of you care to ask." A few murmurs from the crowd. Someone whispered, "Did he say Vietnam?" Sergeant Brody's jaw clenched. "You think this earns you special treatment? That because you're old, you can defy orders?" "I'm not defying," Walter answered, still stroking the dog's head. "I'm remembering, and so is he." Brody took a step forward, voice rising. "I've had enough of this." But before he could finish, a clear, firm voice cut through, the tension like a knife. "That's enough, Sergeant." Everyone turned. From the courthouse steps descended a young black woman, early 30s, crisp navy blue suit, heels clicking with quiet confidence. A leather briefcase hung at her side. Her badge, real, legal, powerful, flashed from her waistband. Rosa Daniels, civil rights attorney. "I've been standing here since you rolled up, watching you escalate a non-crime into a spectacle," she said. "And I have the entire incident recorded." Brody scowled. "This is police business. You need to step back. I'm an officer of the court, and you're inches away from violating about 6 different statutes, including unlawful detainment, abuse of force, and canine misconduct." Brody opened his mouth, but Rosa stepped closer, eyes locked on him. "You didn't ask him who he was. You assumed. You saw a black man on a bench and decided he didn't belong." Collins blinked. Rames looked away. Walter watched quietly, still seated, Kilo beside him like a guardian. Rosa turned toward him. "Sir, may I ask your name?" He nodded gently. "Walter Gaines." She looked back at the officers. "You just tried to arrest Staff Sergeant Walter Gaines, recipient of the Bronze Star, former military K-9 handler, and retired corrections officer. He has every right to sit here." Gasps rippled through the bystanders. A man in the crowd murmured, "My uncle served with him." Someone else said, "Is this real life?" Silence fell heavy. Brody, suddenly aware of the growing number of phones pointed in his direction, took a step back. "You're interfering." "No, Sergeant," Rosa said, voice rising. "You interfered. With a veteran's peace. With dignity. With justice." She turned to Collins, whose hand had started to lower. "Deputy, do not touch him. That's a direct legal instruction. Unless you want this on every news channel by morning." Collins hesitated, then stepped away. Walter gave a faint smile, the kind that's seen too much to be surprised. Rosa approached him, lowering to eye level. "Mr. Gaines, may I sit with you?" He nodded. She sat beside him, resting, her hands in her lap. The courthouse faded behind them. The flashing lights felt further away now. Walter broke the silence. "Thank you." "No," Rosa said quietly. "Thank you." They see uniforms and forget the people beneath them. But today, that dog reminded them. Walter glanced at Kilo. "Funny, isn't it? Sometimes the one who's trained to bite is the one who shows mercy. Kilo looked up at him, eyes soft, tail wagging once. The courtroom was colder than Walter expected. The air conditioning buzzed above like a distant wasp. Rows of pew-like benches were filled, some with curious civilians, others with reporters who recognized his face from the viral video. Still, no one met his eyes. Walter sat handcuffed at the defendant's table, his shoulders straight, but his wrists bound like a criminal. Rosa Daniels sat beside him, jaw tight, flipping through a folder thick with documentation. Her expression was composed, but beneath it burned a fire, sharpened by exhaustion. The bailiff called, "All rise," and the Honorable Judge Malcolm Peters entered, robe hanging stiff from his lean frame. He looked tired, uninterested, and slightly annoyed. His glasses slid down the bridge of his nose as he glanced at the case summary. "Unlawful loitering and failure to comply," he read aloud. "Anything else?" "No, Your Honor," the prosecution said. "But we recommend a fine and mandatory behavioral compliance course." Rosa stood slowly. "I object, Your Honor, and I request dismissal with prejudice." The judge blinked, uninterested. "You can argue your motion." "Keep it brief." Rosa didn't flinch. She approached the bench and began to lay out document after document like sacred relics. Photocopies of military commendations, aged photographs of Walter in uniform, deployment records, discharge papers, and finally, a letter from the veterans. Affairs Department commending Walter's service. "This man," she said, turning to gesture at Walter, "is Staff Sergeant Walter Gaines. He trained K-9 units for the U.S. Army in Vietnam, saved countless lives, and earned the Bronze Star. After his service, he worked 30 years in state corrections. He's a widower, a grandfather, and he was not trespassing. He was mourning." The room stilled. Rosa lifted one last paper, a photo, a modest gravesite. The bench where he sat is directly across from the county courthouse, but more importantly, it's in view of the memorial fountain where his wife's ashes were scattered 2 months ago. That bench wasn't a perch for protest. It was his pew of remembrance. The judge shifted. "Why didn't he say any of this when officers asked him to move?" Walter lifted his head, slowly, deliberately. "I stopped explaining myself to uniforms a long time ago," he said quietly, his voice rasping against the heavy silence. Gasps swept the courtroom. A woman covered her mouth. A young officer in the gallery looked down at his boots. Walter didn't look for sympathy. His eyes stared straight ahead, calm, dignified. Rosa let the words hang in the air before continuing. "Your Honor, the video that went viral, where a trained K-9 refused to attack him, has been viewed over 6 million times since yesterday. Even the dog recognized the dignity in this man. Why couldn't our system?" The prosecution fumbled. "It's not relevant. The arresting officers followed protocol." "Did they?" Rosa interjected, her tone sharp. "Or did they profile a silent black man in a public space and assume the worst?" Judge Peters tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence her, but to ground himself. He looked toward Walter again. For the first time, really looked. "You have medals," he said, "but you refused to comply with a direct order. Why?" Walter exhaled. "Because I wasn't in the wrong. And because some orders ain't about law, they're about power." A long pause. "I was polite. I was seated. I was grieving," Walter continued. "I buried my wife without a military salute. I scattered her ashes quietly, without family. Around that bench, that's where I come to talk to her. That's where I sit when I don't want to cry inside a church." A single cough echoed in the back of the courtroom. Nobody moved. The judge glanced toward the handcuffs on Walter's wrists. "Remove those," he ordered. The bailiff stepped forward and unlocked them. Walter rubbed his wrists slowly, more from habit than pain. Rosa sat back down beside him, visibly calmer. The judge cleared his throat. "I'm vacating the charges. This court apologizes to Mr. Gaines for the treatment he endured." Walter didn't speak. He just nodded once, but Rosa wasn't done. "One more thing, Your Honor," she said. "This wasn't just a mistake. This was a mirror. What happened to Mr. Gaines happens to countless others, only without a dog to defend them. If not for the footage, he might be sitting in jail. Or worse." The judge didn't argue. He simply looked older than he had minutes ago. "I'll forward the footage and incident report to Internal Affairs." Dismissed. With a bang of the gavel, the room began to move again. Rosa helped Walter to his feet. The gallery, once silent, now filled with quiet nods and murmurs of respect. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. But Walter didn't speak to them. He didn't need to. He walked to the bench where it all began, sat down, folded his hands, and beside him, Rosa sat too. This time, nobody dared ask him to move. No one expected the dog to be in the courtroom, but there he was. Ranger, the German shepherd, led in by his handler, Officer Chavez. The same dog the world had watched in stunned silence as he disobeyed a direct command to attack. Judge Peters raised an eyebrow. "Is this a stunt, Ms. Daniels?" Rosa stood confidently. "Not a stunt, Your Honor. A demonstration." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The bailiff cleared a space. Walter sat quietly at the defense table, his hands resting in his lap. He watched as Ranger was led into the open space before the bench. Chavez looked uncertain. "I'm not sure about this." "Do nothing," Rosa said. "Let Mr. Gaines lead." Chavez nodded hesitantly, then unhooked the leash. The dog stood still for a moment, then scanned the room. His ears twitched. Walter didn't rise, didn't speak. He simply lifted his hand, steady, open. The dog's ears perked. Then, slowly and without confusion, Ranger padded toward Walter. No hesitation, no suspicion. He sat down beside him, leaned gently against his leg, and looked up with quiet loyalty. A gasp spread through the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward. Walter stroked the dog's head gently. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Rosa let the moment linger. Then she spoke. "Your Honor, this is what respect looks like. It isn't taught through force. It's earned, through presence, through energy, through character. Ranger here is trained to obey force, but he chose something else. He chose recognition. This dog understood Mr. Gaines's dignity, when trained officers did not." Silence. Rosa continued, voice now quieter but more powerful. "We live in a country where veterans come home and are treated like strangers, where black men are assumed to be threats before they're seen as citizens. But respect," she said, glancing at Ranger, "is a language even dogs remember, and we somehow have forgotten." The judge blinked slowly, his jaw working like he was swallowing emotion. The prosecutor stood, stiffly. "We withdraw all charges." Gasps again, but this time filled with relief. The judge didn't bang the gavel immediately. He stepped down from the bench, something rare, and approached Walter personally. His voice was quieter now, almost human. "Mr. Gaines, I owe you an apology. Not just for this courtroom, but for every door you were asked to knock on twice. For every question you answered just to exist in peace. For every moment you were overlooked, even as you served people like me." Walter met his eyes. He didn't smile, didn't bow, just nodded. The judge extended his hand. Walter didn't take it, not out of defiance, but because the apology wasn't a transaction. It wasn't for show. It was just the truth, long overdue. "I was never asking for a medal," Walter said, softly. "Just a place to sit." The judge nodded. He turned back to the room and said, "Let the record show. The charges are vacated. The name of Walter Gaines is cleared, with honor." Chavez clicked his tongue, and Ranger returned to his side, but the dog looked back once, just once, before exiting, ears low, like he too understood the gravity of what had just occurred. The crowd stood in reverent silence as Walter rose. Rosa gathered her things, but she didn't speak either. She understood now that this wasn't a case that needed winning. It was a wound that needed witnessing. Walter stepped out into the bright Alabama sunlight. Reporters swarmed again, but he walked past them all. Same calm gait, same quiet dignity. He walked back to the same bench, his bench, and sat down once more. This time, no one told him to move. This time, everyone watched. Not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. The morning after the trial, the courthouse steps feel different. The same bench waits beneath the old magnolia tree. Same chipped paint. Same spot of sun catching its edge. Walter walks toward it slowly, the folded American flag still clutched gently in his hands. But this time, people don't look away. They see him. Some nod. Others stop. One by one, Strangers approach. A young mother with a stroller places a hand on Walter's shoulder. A teenager wearing headphones pulls them off, says quietly, "Thank you, sir." An older white veteran, cap in hand, asks if he can shake Walter's. Walter rises, nods once, and they share a long, wordless clasp of hands. Rosa appears, standing nearby with a soft smile. "Heard they've updated the city record," she says. "You're officially no longer listed as a trespasser." Walter chuckles under his breath. "Took 'em long enough." "Also," she adds, stepping aside, "you've got a friend who's been asking about you." From around the corner trots Ranger, tail wagging, ears perked. The same dog who once stood between Walter and a police order now walks toward him without command. This time, he isn't wearing a vest, no leash, no badge, just freedom. Rosa hands Walter a simple folder. "The department approved it this morning. Ranger's been retired and transferred." Walter blinks. "To me. He's yours, permanently, Ranger." Reaches him just as Walter kneels, the flag shifting slightly in his lap. The dog leans in, licking Walter's face once, before resting his head on the veteran's knee. Tears spring to Rosa's eyes, but she doesn't move. Walter sits back down, the flag nestled in one hand, the dog resting beside him. That afternoon, a local newspaper headline makes waves. "Dog honors a soldier. Why couldn't we?" The photograph beneath it shows Walter sitting on the bench, son on his shoulders, Ranger at his feet, the folded flag in his lap. A portrait of grace against a backdrop of justice delayed. No drama, no spectacle, just truth. A cameraman from a national news outlet tries to ask a question, but Rosa intercepts. "No interviews," she says. "Not today." Walter strokes Ranger's head slowly, his fingers steady despite the deep lines of age and grief. He stares at the sky for a long moment before speaking. She would have liked this. Rosa sits down beside him. "Your wife?" she asks. He nods. "We used to come here sometimes," Walter says. "Before she got sick. She liked this tree. Said the magnolias looked like candles when they bloomed." He pauses, swallowing hard. "I sat here because this was the last place I kissed her. She passed a week later." Rosa reaches for his hand, but says nothing. Walter glances down at the flag. "I brought it with me," he says softly, "because it was hers too. We earned it together." For the first time in all these long days, a single tear falls down Walter's cheek. He doesn't wipe it away. He lets it stay. Because dignity doesn't need to roar. It doesn't need to argue. It doesn't beg to be seen. It simply exists. The courthouse behind him. The town buzzing with headlines and realizations. And yet none of that touches this moment. Just a man, a memory, and a loyal dog who refused to forget what honor really meant. The day fades slowly, golden light soaking the pavement. The shadows grow long. Walter leans back, his eyes half closed. For the first time in a long while, no one asks him to move. And for the first time, he doesn't feel alone. Not because of the apologies, not because of the dropped charges, but because, finally, they saw him. He was never just a man on a bench. He was Walter Gaines, a soldier, a husband, a man who gave and kept giving. And now, at last, he had his place.